Thank you. Thanks for being here in person. Those of you who've joined either on the Heritage live stream or via C-SPAN, welcome to what will be a great talk by Ben Shapiro and hopefully an equally good conversation. It's mostly up to Ben, but yours truly will be asking some questions. I think we can count on him. And then the last 10 or 15 minutes or so, questions from you. So be thinking about that. And we'll cue you on how to ask those questions here in a minute. Ben Shapiro really does need no introduction. But the introduction that we at Heritage would give him is patriot, man of faith, someone who understands geopolitics, domestic politics, trusted counselor, and as I remind him, because my Gulf of America speaking cadence is slower than his, that I'm grateful that he packed so many words into 1 minute, because truly, this is a time when we need truly cheerful warriors, which Ben is, to be great witnesses to all of those things, faith, family, and country. And at the risk of perhaps preempting what he will say at the beginning of his talk, I thought I would cue him with his own words from the introduction of this wonderful book, which I finished recently. By recently, I mean about 30 minutes ago. I've got a rule. I don't do book talks or interview book authors without reading the book. Sometimes I've regretted that rule, but not today. This is a truly good book. This is what Ben says. The lions move slowly, their limbs weary, their breath labored. They are vulnerable. The scavengers lurk in the shadows. They gather in the darkness, and then they attack. One by one, they kill off the lions who are too tired to fight, too divided to unite, too old to roar. Soon, very soon, the scavengers will master the world. Unless. Please join me in welcoming Ben Shapiro.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to see all of you, and of course, it's an honor to be here at the Heritage Foundation. My relationship with Heritage Foundation goes back nearly a quarter century, really. When I was 17 years old, I began writing a syndicated column on politics, and townhall.com, which was then associated with the Heritage Foundation, was the very first outlet to actually pick up my column. And I've spent decades, like most conservatives have, using Heritage's fantastic research resources and learning from their extraordinary roster of scholars. Heritage Foundation has always been perhaps America's leading institution in helping to define and shape the contours of conservatism. And so today, I want to begin by acknowledging the elephant in the room. The conservative movement is in flux. It's in flux because of the systemic failure by conservative leaders to do what any good leaders must do, to find and maintain the foundations of that movement. This is our job. If we care about conservatism, if, as Heritage Foundation proclaims, our goal ought to be to formulate and promote conservative public policies based on the principles of free enterprise, limited government, individual freedom, traditional American values, and a strong national defense, then we must stand up against those who would pervert and twist the conservative movement into a movement without principles, or worse, a movement that promotes the very opposite of the principles that conservatives hold dear. So let me begin with a non-controversial statement. A country without borders is not a country. America, for example, is a country. It is a country with certain ideals embodied in the Declaration of Independence, with certain governmental structures embodied in the Constitution of the United States, with a certain culture rooted in Judeo-Christian thinking and springing from Anglo-American traditions. If America does not protect its borders, America ends. A country without a border is no country at all. If we take in millions of people out of sympathy, and those people fail to assimilate to our values, then we lose our character as a country. And if we choose as our leaders those who would effectuate and champion this sort of perverse policy, we betray ourselves and our country. Now, let's discuss the conservative movement. The conservative movement also requires a border. A conservative movement without a border is no conservative movement. We are a welcoming movement. But those who seek to undermine the character of conservatism must never be granted legitimacy as voices of our movement. Conservatism requires ideological border control. American conservatism is a term with a definition. We use terms because they have meaning. Definitions, by nature, delimit, they distinguish. And the term American conservatism has a meaning. That meaning is embodied in the Heritage Foundation's mission statement. Let me read it again, more slowly. Quote, the principles of free enterprise, limited government, individual freedom, traditional American values, and a strong national defense. Those who oppose those principles definitionally oppose American conservatism. That is just definitional. Such people are not ideological allies. They are not part of the rich debate that is constantly ongoing between various strands of conservatism. They are opponents, and they ought to be treated that way. Which brings us to Tucker Carlson, who has become, by any honest assessment, an opponent of conservatism, an outsider masquerading as an insider, and destroying the character of the conservative movement in the process. Let me begin with free enterprise. Free enterprise is rooted in the idea of private property, and private property is rooted in the idea of man as a creative agent made in the image of God. John Locke, one of the great influences on the American founding, explained, quote, every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever he then removes out of the state that nature hath provided, and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. From private property springs the system of the free market. Free markets are rooted in the simple recognition that if I own my property, I ought to be able to trade it, dispense with it, or invest it, as I see fit, so long as those decisions do not infringe upon the equal rights of others to do the same. Free markets are just, because justice requires that we each ought to have the same right to the advantage of our natural abilities. The alternative is tyranny. Tucker Carlson has unending critiques of the free market. Mirroring Marxist thinkers of the past 2 centuries, Carlson argues that the free market is inherently dehumanizing. Appearing on my show in 2019, Carlson said, quote, I'm not a socialist, but I'm totally fine with the comparison to Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders on this one specific point. Is the goal of our economy to serve the people who live here, or are the people who live here merely units of production in a global economy? If you believe the former, then you're on my side. This, of course, is a false choice and a classic straw man. People are both economic actors and also citizens of countries. But to posit the two in opposition is inherently to stack the deck against capitalism. There is no limiting principle at all to the idea that the economy is directed to, quote, serve the people who live here. Centralized control is rooted in precisely this idea. The economy is designed to protect the rights of individuals, and speaking collectively about the economy in this fashion is a quick road to collectivism, which presumably is why Tucker has called for banning self-driving trucks and high credit card interest rates and mergers that include layoffs, why he has called venture capitalists vulture capitalists and maligned Bill Ackman as a useless person motivated by amoral greed, why he has suggested that any venture capital firm that buys a failing firm and sells off its assets and shuts it down should actually be made illegal. It is why, presumably, he has praised left-wing figures ranging from Elizabeth Warren to Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez to Zoran Mamdani. It is why Tucker Carlson says, quote, the main threat to your ability to live your life as you choose does not come from the government anymore, but it comes from the private sector. This is patent nonsense. Perhaps Carlson frequently finds himself having to say that he isn't a socialist because often he sounds so much like one. Of course, Carlson is certainly a capitalist in the most obvious way. He's happy to sell nicotine. Limited government. Limited government is rooted in the idea of individual rights and liberty. Limited government is the flip side of individual freedom, and unlimited government means that no individual freedom can exist. The Constitution, the single greatest governmental document ever framed by human beings, is the embodiment of this idea, of course. To Tucker Carlson, unfortunately, the Constitution is a mere ruse, a sham. Instead, Tucker Carlson promotes a conspiracy theory by which the American people have lost total control of their lives and thus have no real ability to shape policy. Now, this criticism by Carlson is rooted in a fundamental truth. The regulatory state, never envisioned by the founders, has overrun all boundaries and it has run out of control. The executive branch has become the repository of nearly all policymaking, in a way the founders certainly never intended. But conservatism argues that a return to the traditional structures of checks and balances between the branches and federalism between the states and the federal government ought to be the goal. Tucker Carlson believes that foreign powers have hijacked our government, that conspiratorial elite, immovable and undefeatable other than through centralized power, has taken control. In 2018, Tucker Carlson said Washington leaders have confirmed our country's democracy is fake. If the population starts to believe it's all fake, that they're not really in charge, their votes don't matter, what will they do? Well, what they would do presumably is revolution. Because if our constitutional structures are utterly insufficient, we have lost control. In fact, according to this view, the entire classically liberal structure of our system is wrong. As Tucker Carlson recently put it in his podcast, and this is a direct quote, feudalism is so much better than what we have now, because at least in feudalism, the leader is vested in the prosperity of the people he rules, which is a strange contention to make about feudalism if you know literally anything about the history of feudalism. He said, quote, if all your serfs die, you starve. There's a true incentive to care for those people. Nothing says caring like feudalism. The founders would have hated nothing more than such sentiments. Thomas Jefferson called feudalism an engine of immense oppression. Alexander Hamilton argued that the Constitution was designed to replace feudalism with allegiance to law. John Adams called feudalism a brutal, quote, system of inequity. And they were right, which is why the Constitution is designed the way it is and why conservatives should seek to uphold and strengthen it. Then there is a strong national defense. Obviously, the hallmark of the conservative movement when it comes to foreign policy has been peace through strength for generations. That means a realistic assessment of our interests and our opposition. It means a recognition that absent a strong America in the world, Americans become less safe, less prosperous, and less free. It also means recognizing America's historic contributions to global peace and prosperity. Tucker Carlson recognizes none of this. Russia, for example, is a geopolitical enemy of the United States. To pretend otherwise is idiocy. Alexander Dugin, often called Vladimir Putin's brain, who calls Russia the geographical axis of history and argues that Russia must not be a regional power, but an imperial one, has been a guest on Tucker's program. Dugin says that Russian expansion is not a question of living space, but the establishment of a special Russian type of worldview, which is accentuated eschatologically and claims to be the last word in earthly history. America, in the view of Alexander Dugin, is the existential enemy of Russia's vision. This means, quote, the rejection of U.S. strategic control and the rejection of the supremacy of economic market liberal values. As I say, in April, Tucker Carlson featured Alexander Dugin on his show, where he characterized him as, quote, a writer who writes about big ideas, and painted him as a victim of Western powers, while giving Dugin space to call Vladimir Putin, you know, a dictator, murderer, arch opponent of every president that has ever faced him down, quote, a traditional leader who stands strong defending traditional values. And of course, Tucker also interviewed Putin, an interview so soft that even Putin mocked Carlson for it. Carlson himself argues that we ought to ally with Russia. He said that this week. When questioned about Vladimir Putin's brutal history of slaying his political opponents, Carlson answered, quote, leadership requires killing people, while equating Putin's sins with those of America's leaders. Carlson famously traveled to Russia to praise their bread and subways in full Walter Duranty fashion, all while explaining that the average person doesn't care as much about abstractions, meaning democracy, property rights, rule of law, as, quote, the concrete reality of his life. Then, in order to obscure the geopolitical realities of Russian aggression, Tucker Carlson explains that Putin is no threat to Americans. Quote, has Putin ever called me a racist? No, but he has supported regimes throughout the world that threaten North American interests and military forces. He has infiltrated his influence into South and Latin America. He has opened the bloodiest war in modern European history. Those things might be slightly more important to America's foreign policy interests than whether Tucker Carlson has been personally offended by Vladimir Putin's commentary on race. But this is Tucker Carlson's typically anti-American foreign policy, which has become essentially indistinguishable from the thought of far leftists like Noam Chomsky. Venezuela, says Tucker Carlson, is now being targeted by globo homo. That's a thing, apparently. It's being targeted by globo homo because it is, quote, on social policy, one of the most conservative countries in North, South, or Central America. Never mind that Venezuela, of course, is a communist hellhole that has driven millions of people into exile, flooding America's borders, resulting in mass migration, as well as shipping drugs in the United States to kill Americans. By the way, this is in and of itself an idiotic point. North Korea is also quite socially conservative, but that does not make its regime morally or geopolitically defensible. China, of course, is a geopolitical enemy of the United States, a fact that the Trump administration has admirably made crystal clear in both rhetoric and policy. And yet, Tucker Carlson's frequent guest, Jeffrey Sachs, is an arch-globalist and fan of the Chinese regime who spends his time talking about the shortcomings of America's foreign policy. And then there's Iran, which Tucker Carlson has glazed repeatedly, even going so far as to have the president of Iran on his program and ask 0 difficult questions, which Tucker admitted, saying, quote, "There's no chance he's going to answer honestly. So then why have an interview?" Or, of course, Qatar, which Tucker Carlson treats as America's foremost ally in the Middle East, dismissing its financial support for terrorist groups like Hamas, ties with Iran, and anti-American propaganda networks like Al Jazeera. Carlson just announced recently that he's buying a house in Qatar. He said this was to show that he is an American. Really? That's strange because Qatar doesn't allow public displays of Christianity by churches and currently holds tens of thousands of people from foreign nations in slave labor conditions, many of them Christians. Or there's Hamas itself, which Carlson has called a political organization, and whose nefarious propaganda Carlson echoed and continues to echo daily. Carlson, of course, reserves his chief foreign policy ire, unsurprisingly, for Israel, with which he has a peculiar obsession. Unwilling to attack President Trump's foreign policy on Israel directly, he has instead suggested nefarious Israeli influence in American government, up to and including posing a question this week on X as to whether America's current operations against Venezuela are being driven by the Israelis. Which, I mean, no. Carlson says that the people he, quote, dislikes more than anybody in the world are Christian Zionists, whom he says engage in heresy and also have a brain virus. All of this presumably based on his thorough understanding of the Bible, which he admits he first read from start to finish in 2023, 2 whole years ago. And as for America's historic role in the world, particularly since World War II, Tucker has little but scorn. Presumably, this is why he has spent the last several years touring the world condemning America and Britain for fighting the Nazis in World War II, insisting that the West won a Pyrrhic victory in that war and that Winston Churchill was essentially a failed leader. In fact, he calls revisionist pseudo-historian Darrell Cooper, whose sympathy for the Nazi movement and fandom of Holocaust deniers is well cataloged, quote, America's best and most popular historian, and has hosted him repeatedly. And this brings us finally to traditional American values. Obviously, America is rooted in traditional values, biblical values, Christian values, things like the Ten Commandments and church life and a strong religiously based social fabric. The fundamental biblical value, the one that God holds in high esteem, is, of course, truth. Now, of course, Tucker Carlson agrees with traditional conservatives. He and I agree on issues like same-sex marriage or the evils of radical gender ideology, even though he has downplayed the Trump administration's victories on matters like radical gender ideology as essentially of very little consequence. But on a fundamental level, traditional American values, the biblical worldview, require truth as a priority. Truth is not Tucker Carlson's priority. He likes speculation. He likes conspiratorial question asking. But evidence and truth are not of particular value to Tucker Carlson. And so Tucker Carlson has trafficked in nearly every conspiracy theory under the sun. He has accused the Trump administration of covering up a Mossad-run child sex trafficking ring run by Jeffrey Epstein, without, of course, actually mentioning Donald Trump's name, because Tucker is a coward when it comes to President Trump. He has suggested government involvement in 9/11 only a few years after correctly dismissing that theory. He has cast conspiracist and ambulatory psychotic Alex Jones as a prophet. Not, says Tucker Carlson, a conspiracy nut, a prophet. Alex Jones, it should be noted, is the man who claimed that Sandy Hook was staged, 9/11 was a government-initiated operation, and that more than one of his political opponents controlled pedophilic sex rings. In fact, Tucker Carlson has repeatedly hosted conspiracists on nearly every topic under the sun, uncritically nodding at their most bizarre assertions. And unfortunately, it gets worse, because Tucker has also hosted pornographer and accused human trafficker and rapist Andrew Tate on his program to help him dismiss his crimes and to promote his horrific and anti-conservative takes on relations between men and women as self-improvement. And, of course, Tucker Carlson has hosted and glowingly treated America's foremost Hitler apologist, Nick Fuentes. None of it comports with traditional American values. Now, I'm not going to speculate on why Tucker is doing what Tucker has been doing over the course of the last couple of years. I don't know his motives, and frankly, I don't care, because motives are of no consequence. What matters is that he has a gigantic audience, and people listen to him, and he is lying to those people. And he is mostly lying when he says that he is doing all of this in the name of a conservatism that does not resemble actual conservatism in any way, shape, or form. Tucker is a highly talented broadcaster, of course, and that means that many people, millions of people presumably, are being led down a primrose path to frustration, to demoralization, and to enervation. Because here's the thing. If you reject free enterprise, you reject individual initiative. If you reject limited government, you reject individual rights. If you reject a strong national defense, you open the door to America's enemies. And if you reject traditional values, you reject both truth and decency. Tucker Carlson has rejected the central premises upon which conservatism and therefore America stand. But the real question isn't about Tucker Carlson. It's about a conservative movement that purports to treat him as a thought leader. A movement without a border is no movement. A conservatism that treats Tucker Carlson as a thought leader is no conservatism. If conservatives do not stand up and draw lines, conservatism and the dream of America itself will cease to exist. It will cease to exist because the conservative movement will have committed suicide. No country can exist without borders, and no conservative movement can exist without principles it will defend against those who would degrade them, even from within. Heritage Foundation has always been the institution defining the contours of conservatism. If Heritage Foundation wishes to retain its status as a leading thought institution in the conservative movement, it must act as ideological border control. It must continue to draw the contours of legitimate, real conservatism. This is what the institution exists to do. Again, ideological border control is not censorship, it is recognition of reality. And conservatism has, above all, one priority, one fundamental idea: truth. Not friendship, not emotive declarations about hidden nefarious forces, not conspiratorial theories backed by little evidence linked with spit and bubblegum. Truth. And here is the simple truth. Conservatism means something. And if we refuse to stand for it and fight for it and defend it, it will disappear. And with it, so will the last best hope of mankind. The alternative is a conspiracism that demoralizes. A conspiracism that argues that our ideals embedded in the Declaration of Independence are insufficient, that our systems embedded in the Constitution frustrate human purpose, that equal rights before the law, that's a sham, and that free markets are a ruse. The reality is precisely the opposite, of course. Conspiracism destroys the American spirit. When Ronald Reagan left office in 1989, he issued a warning. He said, we've got to do a better job of getting across that America is freedom. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare. It's fragile. It needs protection. That warning remains prescient. If we lose our American spirit, we lose America. And the great lie, the lie that all of our systems have failed, that the Constitution has failed us, the principles of the Declaration have failed us, that free markets are failing us, that strong national defense is merely a form of payoff, that somehow the Constitution and limited government are a complete chimera. If we lose all of that, if instead we move toward conspiracism, we lose the American spirit. We must fight the great lie. That is the great lie, that we are not in control of our own lives and that nefarious forces beyond our control have twisted all of the institutions that America is built upon and the ideas America was built upon into something perverse. In the book of Genesis, God tells the story of Cain and Abel. Cain brings a sacrifice to God, so does Abel. God accepts Abel's sacrifice, but not Cain's. We never really find out why. The Bible doesn't say why one sacrifice is superior to another. And Cain is angry. In fact, it was Cain's idea to bring sacrifices in the first place in the book of Genesis. Cain says, why would God participate in this cosmic injustice? Why didn't God choose his sacrifice? And God's answer is simple. He doesn't explain why he did what he did. Instead, he says, why are you angry? And why has your face fallen? Surely, if you do right, there is uplift. But if you do not do right, sin crouches at the door. Its urge is toward you, but you can master it. We can still master our envy and our sin because it's that stuff that leads to the conspiratorial worldview that undermines Americanism and conservatism. We can still build. We are the luckiest human beings in the history of the world to be born into this magnificent country, built on the principles that conservatives seek to preserve. That message shouldn't be discouraging. It should be uplifting. It was the promise of America from the very start. It's the promise of America today. It's the promise of conservatism and the promise made by the Heritage Foundation. And that promise only exists if conservatives do our job to draw lines, to create borders, to protect our principles, to defend those principles, to conserve. Thanks so much.
Good job. Thank you. Thanks for slowing down on some of those words, Ben. It was helpful. Thanks for your talk. Let's talk about what's inside the border, what's inside the conservative movement. And what I mean by that is, because you and I agree far more than we disagree on things, and the disagreement is truly friendly. What do we need to aspire to as a conservative movement? Certainly in reference to building an aspirational vision that convinces voters for the midterm elections in 2028 and other election cycles, but also as a matter of the soul, which I think you touch on in your talk very eloquently, especially that aspirational conclusion. I think laying that down clarifies where on some of the fuzzier questions about what's inside or outside the movement, talking about ideas,
Sure.
I'm not interested in talking about people. Happy to have you here. What are the ideas? What's the aspirational vision on the inside in the same way that immigrants around the world want to come to the United States and inside its borders because of something that we offer?
So I think that the biggest mistake that the conservative movement has made is glomming onto a line that was originally a leftist idea, which was this idea that we are all aggrieved, that we are all suffering from some gigantic grievance here in the United States. Of course, people face real obstacles in life. Those obstacles may range from health problems to problems of actual institutions arrayed against them. And health problems may not be solvable, but what we can do is help get the government out of people's way. We can help defeat institutions that are designed to inhibit people. But I think that the thing that the conservative movement is engaging in right now, and the thing that I think is a real problem, because I don't think this is unique to the left. I think it is the dominant strain of thought on the left. I think it's a creeping and growing strain of thought on the right, is this idea that you do not have responsibility for your own life. There are conspiracies out to get you, and that you are not capable of building. This is the thing we need to instill in Americans. You are born with the greatest opportunity any human beings in the history of planet Earth have been given. Human beings, over the course of human history, have never been given opportunities like you've been given. Living in a country where you can make something of yourself, where you can actually make choices that define your world, where you can take control of your government, yes, by electing people like Donald Trump, yes, by electing people that you actually like. These are opportunities. And when we say to people, and when we go to young people and we say, you're never going to be able to own a home. I mean, look at your situation. You're never going to be able to get married. You're not going to be able to have kids. Okay, you absolutely can get married, and you should. You absolutely can have kids, and you should. And so I think that the right, if we adopt the language of the left, that all problems are solvable by government, the left will simply outbid us. Because the left can always outbid us. They can always throw more money at something, more regulation.
With our money, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And so the number one thing that we need to do, before we even get to public policy, is say that predominantly in a free country, your choices are on you. And you should get up and, as my friend Jordan Peterson says, make your bed. Because if we don't teach people that, we're not even instilling the kind of values that allow for success in a free system. Instead, we're teaching people to be failures. We're telling them to blame everything outside them for the problems that they experience. And I think that's a lie. I mean, frankly, I just think it's a lie. And the way that you see young people talk about, particularly people who are wealthy now, for example, this idea that everybody who's wealthy inherited their wealth, it's not true. It is statistically untrue. Okay, I'm very lucky. I grew up in the United States, which is the greatest luck of all. I grew up in a two-parent household, which is also unbelievable luck, right? Those are the two things that I was lucky in. But I grew up in a house in Burbank, California. That was 1,100 square feet with 3 sisters and me in one bedroom, my parents in the other, and 1 bathroom for 6 people. And you know what? It was a great life.
And you were last in that order.
And it was a great life. It was a great life because this is America, and that was our starter house. And then my parents moved into a slightly bigger house. And then I was able to go to college and go to law school, and I was able to found a company that did $200 million last year. And that's wonderful, right? That's what people can do in a free country. And it's our job to get the obstacles out of your way. But the enemy of that, from conservatives, also from the left, but from conservatives, is vague, specious allegations about unnamed forces that we can't actually fight. It is our obligation as conservatives to either provide people with opportunity or to provide them with an explanation for why an opportunity is not available that is specific and credible and has evidence to back it and solutions attached to it. Otherwise, we're not doing our job.
And that's why looking forward to play the role that I would say Heritage uniquely plays. So thanks for recognizing that. We're focused on the American family, the dignity of work and free enterprise, national security, what it also means to be an American. And there we're getting at citizenship and the rule of law. But I want to go to a tactical question for you, because you emphasized it so much in your talk. And that is, if I were to summarize one of the claims you're making, it's that we can't be engaged as conservatives in the politics of grievance, as my friend and Executive Vice President Derek Morgan, and he is my friend all the time, says, we have to be engaged in a politics of gratitude. If we make that distinction, not just we at Heritage,
yes,
but all of us in the conservative movement, I think you're very willing to make that distinction. It seems as if we could acknowledge the pain, whether it's economic or social or cultural, religious, whatever it is, that thoughtful fellow conservatives are feeling, and build a policy program around that. And it seems as if we put our energy into that, among other things, that the politics of grievance will never become a national movement, which is something our mutual friend Charlie Kirk warned about.
Yes, for sure. And again, I think that the politics of grievance is, I think, the most useful phrase to describe what has become super common. And the problem with the politics of grievance, of course, is that it requires a centralized, collectivized solution in order to solve that politics of grievance. If you have a grievance against a big thing, it requires collective action to end that big thing. So what I've always said to people, and this was true when there was the left, 5 years ago during BLM, was making the claim that America was systemically racist. And so that the whole system was rigged against you. That's a conspiracy theory, right? The conspiracy theory is that it's rigged against black people, for example. And the question I would ask is, what is the specific policy that you don't like, so we can discuss whether it's a good policy or a bad policy, and how we can obliterate that policy if it, in fact, is a racist policy. Because we can all be on the same side of that. Nobody should like racist policy, right? Nobody does like racist policy. And typically, people don't want to talk about that. They like to talk instead about the systemic discrimination. The same thing holds true on the right. When we say the systems are being held, they're being rigged by the globalists in order to achieve X, Y, or Z. Okay, well, you know what we could do? We could discuss whether a specific policy is good or bad, or what its various trade-offs are, and that would be a responsible discussion. But when we say the system is rigged against you, that is an excuse not only for failure, but it's also an excuse for you not to make the decisions that are right in front of you. So to take a hot-button topic that I got myself apparently in hot water on maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, because this happens every couple of days, I was talking on Konstantin Kissin's program, the trigonometry guys. I was talking about the price of housing in New York. And I made the point that there are certain things that we can do to lower the price of housing in New York, right? You can get rid of certain regulations. You can make it easier to build in New York. You could theoretically lower the price of labor by ideally using more technology. There's certain things, but a lot of those things exist sort of at the margins. You're never going to make the price of real estate in New York the price of real estate in Des Moines, Iowa. There are too many people and there's not enough space. And so what I said, and this is the part that got me into trouble, if you are living a life you don't want to live in New York, and the system is not changing right now, you might want to consider moving. And a lot of people on the right and the left got very angry at me. The left got universally angry because that's what they do. It's a mourning, that happened. It's a day ending in Y. But the right got angry because there was a portion of the right that said, no, you are owed a house in New York where you grew up at the price that your parents paid for it. That's nonsense. It's not true. And when you make people promises that are unfulfillable, you end up generating precisely the sorts of grievance politics that end with left-wing collectivized policies that usually achieve the opposite of what they're seeking to achieve. So again, one of the things that I think is really important is separating what public policy can do from what public policy cannot do. And when we confuse those two things, then we end up in this world of competing grievances. And again, we're always going to get outbid by the left. We will. You can see it right now in Obamacare. Right? What the left is doing right now in Obama, they created a failing system. And then when they create a massive subsidy for that failing system, and then that subsidy expires, then they blame it on the right. Because the idea is that you are now being ripped off by the government because you didn't get your check via Obamacare. And the right falls into this trap because the idea is that it's the right's job to solve the government's job to solve the healthcare crisis. Well, the minute that you get involved in the idea that it is, broadly speaking, the government's job to solve a crisis, you're always going to be outbid by somebody who's bidding higher than you. And not only that, you're going to divide Americans from Americans because typically grievance politics breaks down by blaming an unspecified or specified group for your own problems. And that's something the right ought not engage in.
Well said. So just to tease this out on a particular policy issue that's timely for a lot of Americans, it has to do with New York. I'm not trying to give you PTSD on your comment.
It's fine. I'll triple down and quadruple down on that. I lived in LA, and then I moved.
Yep.
And guess what? I moved from LA because the costs were too high. And that doesn't mean everyone can move, but does say something that fewer people in America are moving today than have ever moved in recorded American history, which is kind of astonishing. It is now easier to move than it was 40 years ago, but 40 years ago, 20% of the population moved around, and today it's like 10%. And that's largely because of government subsidization and the belief you can stay where you are and the government will cut you a check to make it easier for you.
And this is a big issue, as you know well. I think we've probably talked about this in previous conversations. In Jacksonian America, just the lack of geographical mobility for Americans. And then that broke open because of very good policy, right, at the federal and state level. That is this historian's way of segueing into a policy question for you. And it does have to do with New York. And it has to do with the mayor-elect's focus, among other things, on the issue of affordability. Tell me what you think about this. This is both a messaging and a policy question. It's a policy question, very obviously, because we have to correct some bad policy that exists, and it's a question about whether you've given some thought, as my colleagues at Heritage have begun doing, on what right housing policy as conservatives should look like. But because so much of what we confront on Capitol Hill here is a messaging crisis, where people on the right accept the narrative framing of the left, it's also a messaging question. I have been told, we've been told at Heritage by well-meaning friends on the right, on the Hill, don't even use the word affordability. And our friendly retort to that is, well, no, it's a perfectly fine word. How about once in a while we co-opt a word from the left and make it ours and then attach really good policy to that? It seems as if the midterms and perhaps even the presidential election may hang in large part on our ability to develop that policy program. So, is that an example of something as we look ahead about what's inside the country or inside the movement that we can articulate an aspirational vision for?
I mean, I definitely think that we can articulate an aspirational vision. I actually tend to agree with President Trump's ill feelings about the term affordability because it's a fungible term. It doesn't have enough specificity to it, right? Because, I mean, raise your hand if you think life is generally affordable. Unless you're very wealthy, you don't feel that life is affordable ever, and that's kind of the norm, right? For the vast majority of my life, until, thank God, we did really, really well, you of course feel things are unaffordable, right? I was talking with one of our employees who's in her early 20s, and she just bought a house with her husband, and she said, I feel like I'm struggling. What am I doing wrong? I said, you're not doing anything wrong. You're 23 years old and you just bought a house. I mean, that's called being 23 years old and buying a house. I mean,
which might be a little on the small side.
Right, exactly. I mean, when I first got married, my wife and I got a condo, and we struggled to pay the rent and the mortgage on our condo. I mean, that's the norm. And so I think that when we talk about affordability, it allows people to sort of hide what they're really talking about. I think the president's supposed to address it tonight. What I hope that he will talk about is wage increases. That's specific. That's something we can measure. That we're going to have wage increases or reduction in the price of food as a percentage of what you're paying. Right? Like things that we can actually measure and get our arms around, because then you can actually say that you've achieved the thing. How do you ever turn to the American public and say, I've made things affordable? Right? There's no point at which there's no kind of bright line where things move from unaffordable to affordable. And what most Americans right now are complaining about, and I understand the president's frustration on this, what most Americans are complaining about are, in fact, the price increases under Joe Biden. When people say things are unaffordable, what they mean is they want the prices back at 2019 levels. And prices are not going back to 2019 levels unless there's a recession. That's just the reality of how monetary policy works. Now, that the new normal is what things cost at the grocery store. And even though Trump has brought down the rate of increase of inflation, a normal rate of inflation in the United States, the target rate for the Fed, I wish it were 0%. I'm an Austrian school guy, not a Chicago school guy. But the normal rate is 2% according to the Federal Reserve, which is an increase in price. And so I think that we need to be more specific when we talk about affordability. And the reality, of course, when it comes to affordability is the only way that things become more affordable, just basic laws of supply and demand, is if you make the supply more plentiful, things become more affordable. That is all. So whatever makes the supply more affordable, the supply larger, as well as supply siders, if you make the supply larger, things become more affordable. Or, theoretically, demand could go down for a product, and that would also make things more affordable, but that's sort of the recessionary side of things. And so the way that you make things more affordable is by getting rid of regulations, making it easier for people to start businesses, making it more lucrative by lowering the income tax and business tax rates, all things that President Trump has done, which is why you are seeing, as the administration claims correctly, wage increases that you were not seeing under Joe Biden. And so I think the message the president needs to deliver is the wages are going to continue to go up, and we're going to alleviate the regulatory policies that are making things less affordable than they otherwise would be.
And that's no surprise to you. That's where our thinking is in terms of policy we'll be articulating in an upcoming paper. because the world does begin and end with heritage white papers. So
I love the heritage white papers. They're awesome.
I know that about you. Thank you. I love you. But I want to talk about the flip side of that, or one factor on the flip side, as we have theorized and attempted to prove, and that is the presence of at least 11.5 million illegal aliens that came to the United States under the Biden administration. It's cutting off that spigot and deporting at least the felons there to some extent who provide additional demand on a constricted supply because of overregulation by the government seems to be a really important factor. And yet there's pushback from people on the right, not that I'm asking that they need to be removed from the movement, but there's pushback from them. What do we do about that? Does the president need to connect those dots between a very successful immigration policy, at least as it relates to closing the southern border, and its effect on economics?
So I think that the only problem with this argument is that this one is a little bit fuzzy. So just on a basic Econ 101.
So clear to us at Heritage.
I know, but on an Econ 101 level, the countervailing argument, just to steel man the countervailing argument, is that when you reduce the labor supply by 11 million people, you are increasing the cost of labor artificially, which means your inputs in building, because there are a lot of illegal immigrants in the labor business when it comes to construction, for example, you're actually artificially increasing the price of labor, which makes it more expensive to build houses. And the houses that are actually lived in by illegal immigrants tend not to be kind of the middle class and up houses. They tend to be the least nice kind of housing available, which is why illegal immigrants tend to live many people in very small houses. So again, that's sort of the counter. Listen, I'm in favor of shutting the border and deporting vast numbers of illegal immigrants, not on the basis predominantly of economics. I think the best economic argument for pushing people who are illegal immigrants out of the country is the welfare argument, the dependency on government services, which is extraordinarily expensive. The Center on Immigration Studies does really good stuff on this sort of stuff. But I think that trying to sort of use the illegal immigration argument as a hammer to hit every single thing, whether it's a screw, a nail, or a baby, I think that's not great politics, and it starts to run a little thin because the president has done such a good job on the southern border. One of the things that I think has been politically detrimental has been successful for the country, which is that the number one issue for people in November of last year was probably the giant wave at the border. At least that was one of the top 3 issues. And then Trump solved it, and now no one cares about it anymore. And so because of that, it's not a major issue for Republicans. And so if I'm looking at the elections, what I don't want to happen is, if you recall back to the first Trump midterm election in 2018, Republicans were actually doing fairly well in the polling, kind of close to the election, and President Trump swiveled into the illegal immigration issue and started talking about the giant caravans that were coming up through the Northern Triangle. And Republicans did not do very well in the midterm elections. I don't think that the illegal immigration issue is closely tied enough to the economy for that to win on a practical, pragmatic level, even though, of course, I agree with the policies that the president and Heritage are espousing on illegal immigration.
I want to ask a follow-up question about legal immigration, but because this is being broadcast on C-SPAN Books, I should probably ask at least one question regarding the book. Fair?
Sounds good. I didn't speak about the book, but you can certainly ask a question.
I noticed you didn't speak about the book.
Yeah, I noticed.
But that's quite all right. No, the beauty of Heritage is we love robust debate.
And surprises.
So you
love surprises.
I think I've proven I'm pretty damn good at surprises.
Yeah.
all a good fun. Thanks. Lions and Scavengers. It's a wonderful framing. Tell the audience, in case they haven't had a chance to read it, although I'm sure everyone in the audience has read it twice. Who are the Lions? And I'm not interested in names, but you feel free, of course, to mention them. Lions and Scavengers.
Yeah, so I mean, the basic framework that I use in Lions and Scavengers, this first occurred to me when I was in Great Britain. I was supposed to do a debate regarding the Israel-Hamas war at University of Oxford. And so my security team was actually quite unhappy with me going to London at all because there were real security issues. I had to stay out about an hour outside of the city at kind of a remote hotel. And I was watching on TV as, hundreds of thousands of people were marching in the streets, legitimately on behalf of Hamas, many of whom were carrying trans pride progress flags. And I think this has been one of the great puzzlements for people who are conservative or even sane. How do you have, queers for Palestine? Like, what is this thing that's happening, right? Because obviously the joke goes, queers in Palestine get thrown off buildings. So what is queers for Palestine? What is that supposed to be? And the only way to really explain that is as an agglomeration of people who really despise the civilization, and their confluence of interest is just tearing it down. Right? You have a lot of people who just don't like the civilization, and the one thing they have in common is this thing. And so that got me thinking, okay, so who are the defenders of the civilization that we live in? What are their characteristics? What are the things that characterize them? And who are the scavengers? That's when this framework first came to me. And so the basic idea of the Lions is that they have a sort of basic philosophy that they don't really think about, but sort of they act in the world upon. And that basic philosophy is that the world is a God-governed place. It is a place that has an underlying sense to it. And if you follow the rules, then you will do better. And if you don't follow the rules, then you will do worse. There's sort of a basic religious pretext to the Lions. It doesn't have to be overt. You can believe that the world is a somewhat logical place without necessarily believing in God. But I think a faith basis for that is the most likely basis to achieve that. The second sort of principle is that you have moral duties in the world. Again, there's a sort of faith-centric idea to this. You're made in the image of God. You're a creative person with actual duties that matter in the world. And then beyond those first two principles, that there's an understandable universe, that you have a duty in that world. And then the idea is that you have to preserve and defend that thing, right? Then it's worth preserving and defending. And so the Lions come in sort of a wide variety of categories that I sort of break down in the book. You have warriors who legitimately defend that civilization on the front lines. You have weavers, who are people who build the social fabric. Right? You don't have to be a warrior in order to do that. That's just going to church, and that's building, joining the PTA and creating communities that provide for the rich and vibrant framework from which freedom springs. And you also have the innovators, the people who are out front doing the kind of Elon Musk stuff, creating and generating wealth for everybody. And then you move over to the Scavengers, and what you see is that the Scavengers are all about tearing down. They believe that we live in a chaotic universe that is ruled by conspiracies on high, and that the only way to overcome those conspiracies is to destroy the institutions. Just burn it all down. They don't have solutions. Their solution is the burning. The burning is the thing that really matters more than anything else. And they will all get together, even though they hate each other, to burn things down. And they also come in a wide variety of sort of types. You have, for example, looters, right? People who believe that all wealth creation is the fault of exploiters. Right? There's the oppressed and the oppressors, and everybody who's rich is an oppressor, and everybody who's unsuccessful is the oppressed, and therefore the oppressed must rise up and destroy the oppressors. And so the systems have to be ripped down. Then you have what I call in the book the lechers, the people who believe that traditional family values are inherently hemming them in their sort of personal expression of how they wish to be. And so a moral framework that says that family, getting married, having kids is the best framework is personally inhibiting, and so that has to be torn down. And so churches, for example, are bad because they are pushing this patriarchal standard of what ought to be, right? How you ought to live. And then you have barbarians, people who are from outside the civilization, who see all the problems with their own civilization as the fault of our civilization, and who we then import, and who then spend their time trying to tear the institutions of America and the West down from within. And so when you separate between those two groups, people basically who want to build and people who want to destroy, then that seems to be a pretty good description of politics in the West at this moment.
Thanks for the summary. Not that you need to hear from me, but it's a great summary of your book, having freshly read it. I promised that we would turn to a few questions from the audience. We have a little bit of time for that, and we're going to actually have all of those routed through my colleague, Virginia Haggerty. There's a QR code there, an email address. Just for the sake of asking as many questions as we can, we will do that. Virginia, first question, please, ma'am.
Hello. Our first audience question is actually about your book. How do conservative balance embracing the lion mentality you write about in your book while acknowledging and dealing with legitimate grievances like illegal immigration?
So I think that lions recognize that there are things in the world that require correction, and they embrace that need for correction and then go and actually do the thing. This is the separation between people who bitch about problems and people who try to solve problems. So lions make it their business to solve problems, which is why we have to be a solutions-based culture. Right? So you can look at illegal immigration, you can spot why it's a problem, and then you try to provide a solution to that, as opposed to, for example, doing what the last administration did and claiming falsely that you need a new piece of legislation, there's nothing we can do, President Trump comes in day one and solves the problem. Right? So lions try to solve problems as opposed to just complaining about them or using the problem as an excuse to do nothing.
Thank you.
Okay.
Virginia, you're on a roll. We've had 2 questions on the book.
Great. Well, this one's not, unfortunately. But what are some solid solutions that could be proposed to unite conservatives in order to resist complacency and move them to promote common sense domestic and foreign policies?
So I think that the number one strategy is to recognize that unity without values is no unity at all. That does not mean, again, this is not a question about...
This is a pure political project about winning elections. There have to be values and principles.
Correct. I mean, and again, that's the distinction between, say, a political candidate and a group like a Heritage Foundation or what we're trying to do over at Daily Wire. Sure. Like if you're a political candidate, obviously you're not going to control everything that everybody who votes for you says. Right? You're going to have a wide variety of people who vote for you, many of whom you disagree with on a wide variety of subjects, and that's just the norm in electoral politics. But it's our job, if we are really a definitionally based organization, so Heritage is, there's a definition to what Heritage is, and it's right on its website, and it's written all over the place, and so you can tell what it is. And so it's our job, if we wish to have a unified movement, and then people can join the movement. Right, that's fine. We can have people who come in. We have people who come and hang out and then decide they want to leave again. We can have new people who come in. Right? Every politician has to build their own coalition. I think one of the great lies that we've seen over the course of the last 20 years in American politics on both the right and the left is that you can pick up the last guy's coalition and just run with it. That is not how this works. Hillary Clinton could not pick up Barack Obama's coalition, and the vice president, if he's the nominee, will have to build his own coalition that is not identical to Donald Trump's coalition because he's not identical to Donald Trump. This is just a reality about the world. But what that means is that who defines the core of that movement is going to have to be people who actually agree on the values. And there can be, again, debate. There's tension between some of the values that we talked about here, right? If you're talking about, for example, traditional values in free markets. So if you're a free market libertarian, you might be totally in favor of prostitution, right? Like a lot of free market libertarians are. They'll say that that's just, sex work. But if you're a traditional values person, those two things are in tension, and traditional values ought to win. Right, those are obviously going to be robust debates, and those have been happening since legitimately the beginning of politics and Plato and Aristotle. All of that is normal. But if we don't draw any boundaries at all, and I think the number one boundary is, are people telling you the truth or are they lying to you? Do they care about the truth? Are they speculating based on no evidence, or are they actually seeking evidence? Are they actually just asking questions, or are they seeking answers? There's a big difference. People who just ask questions are not just asking questions. They're positing specious theories and then suggesting that their ignorance is an excuse for not having an answer. Okay, that's a very different thing from actually seeking answers. It's the job of good-hearted people anywhere in the world, but especially in the conservative movement, to seek answers because specificity unifies. Right? Truth unifies. Falsity and vagary are essentially disunifying.
Thank you.
Okay, question for both of you. How can Ben and Heritage work together to challenge the left's lies about equality and woke culture that are so prevalent in our country?
I mean, that's an easy one. I think we already are. I mean, how do we challenge?
I was going to say, you just go on the air and read Heritage's policy proposal.
I actually think that's true.
In seriousness to the question, we'll answer it.
I mean, I actually think that's true. I think where Heritage has done extraordinary work on so many fronts, particularly, people have asked me, what are the big moves that the Trump administration has made, the most important things they've done? Obviously, shutting the southern border, but the battle against DEI, the destruction of wokeness as government policy, that's a Trump administration victory. Heritage was a heavy force in pushing for that for years before the Trump administration actually did that. And everybody at Heritage deserves enormous credit for having helped to implement that because it was wildly destructive of the American body politic. And so when we're all pushing in the same direction at good things, we can really get things done. And when it comes to wokeness, again, wokeness is a form of grievance politics. It's a racially based grievance politics that benefits certain races at the expense of others. And the solution to that on a conservative level is meritocracy. And that's something that I think that Heritage has historically stood for. It's something that I stand for. And of course, I'd be happy to work together with Heritage in any capacity to promote that.
Well, thanks for that and everything that you've done. And also gratitude to my colleagues, a lot of people, but in particular Mike Gonzalez, who was waving this flag for years. Sometimes it seemed as if, other than his colleagues at Heritage, the lone flag bearer of this issue on Capitol Hill, and you've helped elevate his work and our work. We're grateful for it. Virginia?
Yeah. So what have been your highlights of the Trump administration so far? What are you hoping will get accomplished in a year or two that have not been yet accomplished?
I mean, I mentioned a couple of them. Ending DEI, huge. Destroying the Biden border policy, enormous. I would say that the Trump administration's foreign policy overall has been excellent. One of the great lies about the conservative movement is that there was widespread dissension over, for example, President Trump's strike on Iran. There was not, by any polling data. By any polling data. That was a 92 to 95% popular thing in the Republican Party, as it should have been, because it turns out it was the shortest war America has ever engaged in. It was wonderful. We sent one B-2, and that B-2 dropped one bomb, and that was the end of the war. And it was great.
It's a great model for the
future. It is a fantastic model. We should all be in favor of this model. This is an excellent model. And the president has been able, because I think on a fundamental level, he understands that it's fascinating. New York real estate is kind of a bizarrely zero-sum game, and that applies really, really well to foreign policy, actually, because foreign policy is one of those areas that is a zero-sum game. That somebody is more powerful, somebody is less powerful. Not on an economic level, it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, but when it comes to who's going to win and who's going to lose and who's going to be more powerful, President Trump innately in his bones understands that really, really well and has excellent foreign policy instincts. and that has borne tremendous fruit, particularly in the Middle East. I'm hopeful that it will bear some fruit in the Ukraine war as well. So I think that he's achieved a lot in a short amount of time. Obviously, I've had disagreements, and I'm open about my disagreements with the president on things like tariff policy, which I've disagreed with, or on some of his online commentary, which, again, is of variable quality, in my opinion. But what I would like to see in the next year, it would be good if Republicans, for example, actually were able to come up with some sort of framework that transitioned away from Obamacare. I understand that this is, something that Republicans have been kicking the can down the road on for a long time. We're seeing the costs of that right now as Democrats try to simply increase subsidies and then blame Republicans when the subsidies go away. Realistically speaking, the Republicans are probably going to have to sign along onto some sort of subsidy continuation as a transition until they're able to actually get to something better, but they need to offer something better. Otherwise, it's just going to be continued subsidies from here on in. So I agree with both, weirdly enough, with both Chip Roy, that what is being offered is totally insufficient and kind of crappy, and also with Mike Lawler, that we're going to lose every purple seat in America if you allow the Obamacare prices to double over the course of the next year. And both those things are true, which is why Republicans have to come up with actual solutions, not just pointing and yelling at Obamacare.
Because the Republicans, I won't say we, Heritage, our colleague Nina Schaefer and her team have been great on the policy solution, but the right has allowed the left to dominate the narrative framing, and so it's going to take time in that transition. One more question, and then we'll have some concluding comments.
Okay.
Thanks, Virginia.
Yeah. In the age and environment of AI, how do we find and disseminate the truth?
I mean, this is the biggest question, and I'm going to speak more about this in the coming days. I think that there's more responsibility that's been placed on the public in trying to discern truth than ever before in human history. There's so much out there. Forget about AI. There's just an enormous plethora of opinion and people sitting in their basements, some of whom are good and some of whom are bad at what they do, some of whom care about truth and some who really, really clearly do not care about the truth. And so the onus is on us to be better consumers of information. And I think that there are a few hallmarks of when somebody is telling you the truth. One is you should ask for evidence for their proposition. If they cannot provide you actual evidence of their proposition, and they repeatedly decline to do so, you should probably disregard what they're saying to you. That would be, I think, the number one thing. The other is, are their predictions borne out by reality? If they continue to make prediction after prediction after prediction, none of which come true, and then one bizarro world prediction comes true, that does not mean the other 99 predictions that they made are suddenly good predictions and they are actually amazing bellwethers for reality. And there's a habit that happens sort of on X and in online world where somebody makes an outlandish prediction. They'll say, kind of the Nostradamus thing. 3 years from now, there will be a terrorist attack, and then there's a terrorist attack. So, oh my gosh, this person knows everything. And then it turns out all of their other predictions, like the UFOs are going to land tomorrow, but we just ignore that one. So you actually have to look at people's consistent track record. Also, are people willing to admit when they've made a mistake and then correct those mistakes and explain why those mistakes were made in the first place? Right? Is there any sort of ideological consistency? Are they willing to explain where they're getting their information? Right? These are all things that you would expect from, for example, your doctor. And you should expect it also from the people who give you information. What I've recommended to a lot of people is that you should really try to find a wide variety of viewpoints to listen to, not just the ones who agree with you. And then you should try to determine where sort of the common locus of fact is. And then from there, you can kind of move out to where you think the opinions that you agree with most are. But specificity, I think, is a really key thing. What I find in my own consumption of information is the hosts, the personalities who are the most specific about the things they are talking about are the ones who tend to be more reliable. The ones who are very vague, very general, very speculative, very rarely turn out to be reliable. It's why, to talk up the Heritage White Papers for the 1000th time, Heritage White Papers are great. They're very specific. They're very lengthy and in-depth. Right? And I know that we've decided that there was a movement that happened on the right that is worth condemning, since I'm doing a lot of that today. There's a movement on the right that is worth condemning, and that is the experts get things wrong, and it's terrible when they do that. And the substitute is not to trust the non-experts. The substitute is to be very skeptical of the experts and also skeptical of the non-experts, and then determine where the truth lies. Right? I think that there has been a bizarre substitution in the realm of expertise where the right went, you know what, none of the experts can be trusted. Homeless Bob over here is going to explain to me how all of the world works now, and he has theories about chemtrails. And you're like, well, I could not believe Anthony Fauci and also think Homeless Bob is a bad source of information. Both of those things could be true.
I want to conclude by reading the concluding lines of your book, if I may. This is an exhortation for all of you to get the book and read it and share it. The scavengers you write will never surrender. The battle will go on for the rest of time, but they cannot win unless we let them. When I began writing this book, the scavengers had the upper hand. The lions were weary. They lay in the dust, weary and wounded. The scavengers circled, sniffing blood. Now the lion stands again. All the lions awaken. The lion's pride is returning, and the scavengers should tremble. Count on Heritage to fight with you. Thank you. I'm going to ask you to do that one more time, but after a housekeeping detail. So that we can get Ben to where he needs to be next, please allow him and me to exit the stage before you filter out. And secondly, after tremendous gratitude on behalf of all of my colleagues here at the Heritage Foundation for being here with us in person or online or on C-SPAN, please give this great patriot another round of applause.